May 12, 1945. Private First Class Eugene Sledge pressed his face against the coral limestone, trying to make himself smaller than the rock itself. The stench hit him first, always the stench. 3 weeks on Okinawa had taught him that death had a smell you couldn't wash off, couldn't forget, couldn't escape even in your dreams. It clung to your uniform, your skin, the inside of your nostrils, like a film you'd carry for the rest of your life. The rain came down in sheets, turning the Okinawan mud into a thick, sucking paste that pulled at his boots with every step. Somewhere ahead, through the curtain of rain and smoke, sat what the men had started calling Suicide Hill. Nobody knew its real name. Maybe it didn't have one. The Japanese called it Dakshi Ridge, but to the Marines of K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Regiment, it was just Suicide Hill, and that told you everything you needed to know. Eugene's hands trembled as he gripped his M1 Garand. Not from fear, though God knew there was plenty of that, but from exhaustion so complete it felt like his bones had turned to wet sand. 48 hours without sleep, 72 since a hot meal. The rain never stopped, the shelling never stopped, the dying never stopped. Sledgehammer, Corporal Burgeon's voice cut through the downpour. Are you still breathing over there? Eugene didn't answer right away. He was watching a land crab, bright purple against the gray mud, picking at something half buried in the coral. He knew what it was picking at. They all knew. The crabs had gotten fat on Okinawa. Yeah, Eugene finally called back. Still here. Good, because we're going up that bastard in 20 minutes. Eugene's stomach dropped. He'd known it was coming, they all had, but hearing the words made it real. Suicide Hill rose about 300 yards ahead, a coral and limestone ridge pockmarked with caves covered in the twisted remains of what used to be trees. The Japanese were in those caves. Maybe 100 of them, maybe more. They had machine guns, mortars, and the kind of patience that comes from knowing you're already dead. This was the 4th time K Company had been ordered to take the ridge. The first 3 times, they'd been thrown back with casualties that made even the hardened veterans sick. The hill was a fortress, every cave entrance a killing field, every approach swept by interlocking fields of fire. The Japanese defenders had months to prepare. They knew every angle, every dead space, every spot where a Marine would have to expose himself for just a second, and a second was all they needed. Lieutenant Comiskey appeared out of the rain like a ghost. His uniform was so caked with mud Eugene could barely make out his rank insignia. The lieutenant was 23 years old and looked 50. His eyes had that 1,000-yard stare they all got eventually, the look of a man who'd stopped believing in tomorrow. "Listen up," Comiskey said, his voice barely audible over the rain. "The battalion wants the ridge before nightfall. We're going to assault from the west slope this time and try to get around their main defensive positions." Someone laughed a short, bitter bark with no humor in it. "They tried the west slope yesterday. 15 men went up, 5 came back." "I know," Comiskey said quietly. "I know what you're thinking. But we don't have a choice. The Japs are using that ridge to shell our supply lines. Every day we don't take it, more good men die hauling ammunition and rations up from the beach, so we're going up. And this time, we're staying up." Eugene looked at the faces around him. Snafu, with his cruel sense of humor and dead eyes. F.C. J. DeLoe, who still somehow maintained a spark of optimism despite everything. Ham, the big Texan who never complained. Bill Layden, who read philosophy books when he could and quoted Marcus Aurelius in the middle of artillery barrages. These were the men he'd trained with, fought with, bled with. Some of them wouldn't make it off Suicide Hill. Maybe none of them would. The thing nobody told you about war, the thing they couldn't tell you, was how normal it all became. The first time Eugene saw a dead Marine, he'd vomited until his ribs ached. Now he stepped over bodies without looking down. The first time mortars fell near him, he'd frozen in terror. Now he registered the whistle, calculated the trajectory, and moved with mechanical precision to whatever cover was closest. You didn't become brave. You just became numb. But Suicide Hill was different. Suicide Hill broke even the numb ones. 5 minutes, Comiskey said. Check your weapons. Make sure your canteens are full, there's no water up there. And for God's sake, stay low. The Nips have snipers in those caves, and they don't miss. Eugene went through his pre-combat ritual automatically. Magazines seated properly. Bayonet secured. Grenades accessible but not loose enough to fall off if he had to crawl. He touched the small Bible his mother had given him, tucked in his breast pocket. He wasn't particularly religious, not anymore. Not after Peleliu. Not after what he'd seen men do to each other, but the Bible was from home. From a world where people died in their beds surrounded by family, not face down in Okinawan mud with their guts spilled out. The rain eased slightly, just enough to see the ridge more clearly. That was worse. In the rain, Suicide Hill was just a dark shape in the mist. In the weak afternoon light, you could see the cave mouths, black and empty as eye sockets in a skull. You could see the shattered trees, the torn earth, the debris of previous assaults, helmets, packs, rifles, things that had once belonged to men who'd believed they were going home. "Let's go!" Comiskey shouted. "Move out!" The first 100 yards weren't bad. That was the cruelest part. The ground rose gradually, and there was enough cover shell craters, demolished bunkers, the wreckage of a knocked-out Sherman tank that you could almost convince yourself this would be different. That maybe, just maybe, the artillery barrage had done its job and the Japanese were dead or stunned or too scared to fight. Eugene ran in a crouch, his breath coming in short gasps. The pack on his back felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. His boots slipped in the mud, but he kept moving, kept his spacing from the man ahead, kept his rifle ready. The training had been drilled into him so thoroughly it bypassed his conscious mind. He was just a body moving through space, following the procedures, doing what he'd been taught. Then the shooting started. The sound of Japanese machine guns was distinctive, a faster cycle rate than American guns, a higher pitch that could almost be mistaken for ripping cloth if you didn't know better. But Eugene knew better. He knew that sound meant men were dying, that invisible lines of bullets were cutting through the air at chest height, that if you were standing when that sound started, you probably weren't going to stand much longer. He hit the mud hard, his face in the muck, tasting copper and rot. Around him, other Marines were doing the same, flattening themselves against the earth, trying to melt into the ground. Someone was screaming a high, keening wail that went on until it suddenly stopped. Eugene didn't look. Looking got you killed. "Mortars!" someone yelled, and Eugene curled into a ball, arms over his head, as the world exploded. The thing about mortars was the sound. You heard the whistle first, that awful descending tone like a chorus of demons. Then came the uncertainty. Where would it hit? Would it be close? Would this be the one with your name on it? And then the blast, the pressure wave that slammed into your chest even if the shrapnel missed, the shower of dirt and rock and coral that rained down like hail. The barrage lasted 30 seconds. It felt like 30 hours. When it stopped, Eugene's ears were ringing so badly he could barely hear. He raised his head, blinking mud from his eyes, and saw the carnage, 3 men down, that he could see from his position. One wasn't moving. The other 2 were, but in the wrong way, the thrashing, convulsive movement of men who'd been torn apart. "Corpsman!" The cry went up, that universal plea that echoed across every battlefield. "Corpsman up!" Doc Caswell appeared from nowhere, running in a crouch, his medical bag bouncing against his hip. Navy corpsmen attached to Marine units were the bravest bastards Eugene had ever seen. They carried no weapons, just bandages and morphine, and they ran toward the screaming when everyone else was running away. More corpsmen had earned the Medal of Honor in this war than any other rating. More corpsmen had died too. "Keep moving." Comiskey was on his feet, waving them forward. "Don't bunch up. Keep moving." Eugene pushed himself up and ran. The hill was steeper now, the approach completely exposed. He could see the cave mouths more clearly, dark slits in the coral, impossible to see into, impossible to know if anyone was watching. But someone was always watching, always. A Marine ahead of him jerked and fell, his helmet flying off. Eugene jumped over him without stopping. There was no time. If you stopped, You died. It was that simple. Bullets kicked up dirt around his feet. He zigzagged, trying to be unpredictable, trying to make himself a difficult target. His legs burned, his lungs screamed. The weight of his pack and rifle and ammunition seemed to increase with every step, as if gravity itself was trying to drag him down into the mud, into the earth, into a grave he couldn't see but could feel waiting. 50 yards from the base of the ridge, the ground leveled slightly into a natural terrace, probably a rice paddy once, before the war turned everything on Okinawa into a moonscape. A few Marines had reached it and were using it as a staging point. Eugene threw himself down behind a low berm of earth, gasping for air, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. Bergen slid in next to him. "You hit?" "No." "You?" "Not yet." Bergen's face was gray with exhaustion. He'd been fighting since Guadalcanal, had survived campaigns that killed most of the men he started with. He should have been sent home months ago. But the Corps needed experienced NCOs, needed men who knew how to keep other men alive. So Bergen stayed and kept fighting and watched boys turn into veterans or corpses. "We need to get into those caves," Bergen said, pointing at a cluster of openings about 30 yards up the slope. "That's where they're dug in. As long as they're in there, we can't hold this ridge." Eugene stared at the caves. Black holes in gray stone, each one a potential tomb. The Japanese defensive strategy on Okinawa was built around caves, elaborate tunnel systems that connected positions, allowed troops to move unseen, and made it almost impossible to destroy them with artillery or airstrikes. You had to go in. You had to root them out one by one, in the dark, in close quarters where every corner could hide a man with a bayonet or a grenade. "How?" Eugene asked. Bergen pulled a satchel charge from his pack. "Demolitions. We get close enough. We blow the entrances. Bury the bastards inside." It sounded simple. It wasn't. Getting close meant crossing open ground under fire, placing the charge while machine guns tried to cut you in half, and then running like hell before the explosion. The casualty rate for demo men was astronomical. "I'll do it," Eugene heard himself say. Bergen looked at him. "You sure?" Eugene wasn't sure of anything anymore. But someone had to do it, and sitting here meant dying slowly as the Japanese mortars found their range. At least moving forward gave you the illusion of control. "Yeah," Eugene said. "I'm sure." The approach to the first cave took 10 minutes and felt like crossing hell. Eugene crawled on his belly, the satchel charge strapped to his back, his rifle cradled in his arms. Every few feet he stopped, listening for any change in the firing pattern that might mean he'd been spotted. The Japanese machine gunner was firing in controlled bursts, probably conserving ammunition, probably watching for targets of opportunity. 20 feet from the cave entrance, Eugene could smell something other than the usual death stench: cordite, burnt wood, something cooking. They were alive there. Cooking rice, maybe, or heating tea. Living their lives in the dark while they waited for Americans to come close enough to kill. He pulled the satchel charge around, his hands shaking as he set the fuse. 30 seconds once he pulled the igniter. 30 seconds to place it, get clear, and hope the blast collapsed the entrance. He'd seen satchel charges fail before seen them blow without bringing down enough rock, seen Japanese soldiers walk out of the smoke and dust with rifles raised. A sound from the cave voices, speaking in rapid Japanese. They knew someone was close. Eugene's finger hovered over the igniter. Then, someone inside laughed, a bright, clear sound that could have come from any soldier in any army, the kind of laugh you heard when someone told a joke or remembered something funny from home. For just a second, Eugene saw them as men instead of enemies. Men who probably had families, who probably wanted to be anywhere but this God-forsaken island, who were just as scared and tired as he was. He pulled the igniter. The fuse hissed to life. Eugene didn't think thinking would get him killed. He jammed the satchel against the cave entrance, wedging it between rocks, and then he ran. His legs pumped, his lungs burned, and behind him the fuse counted down the seconds with mechanical indifference. He'd made it maybe 15 feet when the world turned white. The blast picked him up and threw him like a doll. He hit the ground hard, rolled, couldn't breathe, couldn't see. His ears were beyond ringing now, there was just a high-pitched tone that seemed to come from inside his skull. Slowly, the world came back. Gray sky, smoke, the acrid smell of high explosives. Eugene pushed himself up. His uniform was torn, his hands were bleeding, but nothing felt broken. Behind him, where the cave entrance had been, was now just a pile of shattered rock and coral. No movement, no sound. If anyone had been inside, they weren't coming out. "Sledge, get down," Bergen's voice, from somewhere behind. Eugene dropped instinctively, and a fraction of a second later bullets whipped through the space where his head had been. Another cave, another machine gun, another group of Japanese soldiers defending their position with the kind of desperate courage that came from knowing surrender wasn't an option. The rest of the afternoon dissolved into a nightmare of smoke and blood and detonations. One cave at a time, one charge at a time, one death at a time. Eugene lost track of how many charges he placed, how many caves he sealed. He moved through the battle in a daze, his body operating on instinct, while his mind retreated to someplace safe and far away. Sometime around 1500 hours, or maybe 1600, time had lost all meaning. K Company finally reached the top of Suicide Hill. Eugene collapsed behind a pile of sandbags some Japanese unit had built, probably during their initial defense of the island. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was sheltering behind fortifications built by men who were now buried under tons of coral, or burned to ash, or rotting in the caves below. The view from the top was stunning. You could see for miles the ocean to the west, glittering in the afternoon sun, the devastated landscape of central Okinawa stretching away in all directions. In another life, in another world, this would have been beautiful. Now, it just looked like the end of everything. "We hold this position," Comiskey said, moving among the survivors. His voice was hoarse from shouting orders all day. "Dig in. They'll counterattack tonight." Of course they would. The Japanese always counterattacked at night. It was their preferred tactic, infiltration under cover of darkness, using the chaos and fear to create confusion, to retake positions they'd lost during the day. The Marines had learned to expect it, to prepare for it. But that didn't make it any less terrifying. Fighting in the dark, unable to see your enemy, hearing movement all around you, never sure if that sound was a Marine from another company or a Japanese soldier with a grenade. Eugene started digging. The coral was hard as concrete, and his entrenching tool barely made a dent, but he kept at it. A fighting hole, even a shallow one, was the difference between living and dying. The sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that would have been gorgeous if Eugene had any capacity left to appreciate beauty. All he could think about was the coming darkness. They came at 2200 hours. No warning, no preparatory fire, just shadows moving through shadows, the soft pad of feet on coral, and then the screams, "Banzai." Eugene fired at movement, at sound, at nothing. His rifle kicked against his shoulder again and again. The muzzle flashed, destroying his night vision, leaving him blind for precious seconds after each shot. All around him, other Marines were firing too. A ragged chorus of M1S and BARs and Thompson submachine guns, creating a wall of lead that tore through the darkness. Something landed in his foxhole. Eugene's hand found it before his mind understood what it was. The smooth metal of a Japanese grenade, the fuse already lit. He grabbed it and threw it in one motion, no time to aim, just throwing it as far and as fast as he could. The blast came a second later, close enough that dirt rained into his hole. He saw one of them then, materializing out of the darkness like a ghost. A Japanese soldier, young, maybe 19, his uniform torn and muddy, his eyes wide with that same combination of terror and determination Eugene saw in the mirror every morning. They stared at each other for a frozen moment, two young men who should have been in college or working their first jobs or falling in love, not trying to kill each other on a coral ridge in the middle of nowhere. Eugene pulled the trigger. The soldier went down. The battle lasted 3 hours. When it was over, 42 Japanese bodies lay scattered around K Company's perimeter. The Marines had lost 7 men, with another dozen wounded seriously enough to need evacuation. In the mathematics of war, that counted as a victory. Eugene sat in his foxhole as dawn broke over Okinawa, unable to stop shaking. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him hollow and cold, despite the tropical heat. He stared at his hands caked with mud and blood, some of it his, most of it not, and tried to remember what they'd looked like before the war. Clean, he thought. They'd been clean. Bergen appeared in the canteen. Drink. Eugene drank. The water was warm and tasted like metal, but it was water. We held the hill, Bergen said. It wasn't quite a question, but it wasn't quite a statement either. Yeah, Eugene said. We held it. But what did that mean? They'd held a ridge with no name that the brass had decided was strategically important. They'd killed maybe 100 Japanese soldiers who were defending an island they would eventually lose anyway. They'd turned the coral red with blood and made craters out of caves and added a few more names to the casualty list that got radioed back to headquarters every evening. Suicide Hill. They'd taken Suicide Hill, and tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that, there would be another hill with another name, and they'd do it all again. Eugene Sledge survived Okinawa. He survived the war. He went home to Alabama, finished his degree, became a professor of biology. He married, had children, lived what most people would call a normal life, but part of him never left Suicide Hill. Years later he would write about it, about the mud and the rain and the smell and the caves, about the young Japanese soldier he'd killed, whose face he could still see with perfect clarity even as other memories faded, about his brothers in K Company, some of whom made it home and some of whom stayed on Okinawa forever, buried in neat rows in a military cemetery overlooking the ocean. He wrote about how war changes you in ways that can't be explained to people who weren't there, how the sound of rain could trigger memories so vivid they felt more real than the present, how he'd wake up some nights convinced he was back in that foxhole, waiting for the next attack, his hands reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. The Battle of Okinawa lasted 82 days. More than 12,000 American servicemen died. More than 100,000 Japanese soldiers and Okinawan civilians perished. The island was supposed to be the staging ground for the invasion of mainland Japan, an invasion that never came, because 2 atomic bombs ended the war first. Suicide Hill is still there, covered now with vegetation, the caves sealed or collapsed, the coral no longer stained red. Japanese and American veterans have held joint memorials on Okinawa, old enemies shaking hands over ground they once fought to the death to hold. The island is peaceful now, a tourist destination with beautiful beaches and ancient castles. But if you know where to look, if you know which ridge near Dakeshi to climb, you can still find things. A rusted helmet half buried in coral, a spent cartridge case, pieces of shrapnel, small reminders that this peaceful hillside was once a place where young men killed each other in the name of causes they barely understood. Eugene never went back. He couldn't. The Okinawa, he remembered, didn't exist anymore, not because the island had changed, but because the boy who fought there was gone, replaced by a man who carried those memories like stones in his pockets, heavy and cold and permanent. In his book, With the Old Breed, Eugene wrote about the moment he knew he'd survive Okinawa. It wasn't dramatic or heroic. It was just a morning, a few days after Suicide Hill, when he realized he'd stopped caring about dying. Not in a suicidal way, but in a way that meant he'd made peace with whatever came next. He'd done his job. He'd stood with his brothers. If he died, he'd die having done his duty. If he lived, he'd live knowing he'd been tested in the worst way a man can be tested, and he hadn't broken. That was what Suicide Hill taught him. Not courage. Eugene never thought he was particularly brave, but endurance, the ability to keep moving forward even when forward meant into hell, the understanding that sometimes the only way out is through. Most of the men who fought on Suicide Hill are gone now. Eugene passed away in 2001. Bergen followed in 2014. The last veterans of the Pacific War are dying at a rate of hundreds per day, taking their stories with them. Soon, there will be no one left who remembers what it was really like, not the sanitized version in textbooks, but the truth of mud and blood and fear and courage that existed in measures too big for words. But the hill remains. And in its coral and stone, in the caves that now shelter birds instead of soldiers, in the soil enriched by the blood of thousands of young men from two nations, Suicide Hill remembers. It remembers the Marines who climbed it knowing they might not come back down. It remembers the Japanese soldiers who defended it with honor, even in a hopeless cause. It remembers Eugene Sledge and the thousands like him, forgotten men who did unforgettable things in the Pacific War's longest and bloodiest campaign. They called it Suicide Hill. And for the men who fought there, that name tells the whole story of courage and sacrifice, of terror and endurance, of a generation that went to war and came home, changed in ways they could never quite explain to those who stayed behind. If you found yourself moved by Eugene's story and the forgotten men of Okinawa, subscribe to War Unleashed for more untold chapters of World War II history. Share where you're watching from in the comments. Let's prove these stories still echo across the world, from the coral ridges of Okinawa to wherever you are today. These men deserve to be remembered. Their stories deserve to be told.